In the late 80s, Sony began working on their first PlayStation, which was going to be a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. However, in the 90s, after some reported disputes over licensing, Nintendo chose to go with Philips for an SNES CD add-on instead. This never ended up happening, but Nintendo didn't leave Philips empty-handed, allowing them to make Zelda and Mario games for their CDI, but that's another topic for another YouTuber. So, Sony went and made the PlayStation we all know and love today, which competed directly against the Nintendo 64 for domination in the 3D video game space. Mario vs. Crash, Zelda vs. Spyro. These are the age-old debates that raged throughout the internet forums in the 90s and early 2000s. But what would happen if we just talked about the audio and music and ignored gameplay and graphics and all that other garbage? Well, we'd have this video you're about to watch. I'll be breaking this console war down using 3 categories: hardware, interactivity, and iconic soundtracks. The hardware category will concern what actually made these sounds hit our ears. The interactivity category will look at how a gamer could impact the sound of various games while playing them. And the iconic soundtracks category will be based on which exclusive games' soundtracks have withstood the test of time. The judgment of that will be based on a variety of things, but not my subjective opinions, or at least I'll try for that. One of the biggest factors in this console war, both concerning audio and everything else, was Sony's use of discs versus Nintendo's continued use of cartridges. Discs allowed for more storage space, which allowed for more music storage, be it in the form of lengthier amounts of music or higher quality music. Now, the Nintendo 64 could technically do just fine in the sound quality department and pump out CD quality audio itself, but with the limited storage of the cartridge format, high-quality audio files would leave little room for the rest of the game. And that brings us to a related issue for the N64. The thing had no sound chip. The N64's CPU and GPU could handle audio, but it was relatively common to do audio on the main CPU to increase the graphics performance, as this generation was all about showing off those sweet polygons. So you have limited storage space for sound and limited processing power to pump it out. Not a great combo. And because audio could only be handled by the 2 processors, and often only one of them, everything in a game had to share the same space. That's why when the processors are running lots of stuff at once, like 3 to 4 player Mario Kart, the music just goes away. There's not enough processing room for it. The PlayStation, on the other hand, had plenty of storage space with its fancy schmancy discs. And heck, some games made you use 3 of those fancy schmancy discs, as well as a 24-voice mixing system with 512 KB of dedicated sample and working set memory. In simple terms, this meant that a PlayStation disc could hold full-length tracks if they had the storage space available with the rest of the game. Or developers could just toss a few samples in there and have a sequencer play back those samples in a specified order to create music. Kinda like how a player piano could play notes according to instructions fed into it by paper. This versatility was used in games like Doom. If you put your PS1 Doom disc into a CD player, it can actually play a few tracks back, but not the whole soundtrack. What it can't play are tracks that are generated in real time during gameplay using this technique. While techniques could be implemented to compensate for the N64's rough audio situation, such as feeding only portions of one overall sound into the RAM and discarding those portions for more portions once you're done with them, it's just a clear loser in this category due to its lack of versatility. The N64 DD helped things out, but that thing flopped harder than a magic carp out of water. Now let's move on to interactivity. This can take the form of adaptive music, like a new layer of music being added to a song when you enter a new area, or actually taking part in simulated music making. In a US Gamer interview, legendary game composer David Wise explained, with the N64 having MIDI, it meant that we could have dynamic responsive scores that react to the gameplay environments. Even though our competitors could use a CD, it was a fixed track and had limited scope for reactive music. A famous example of reactive music is from Super Mario 64. When Mario steps out of water, drums are added to the stage music, and when he gets back into the water, the drums go away. The PS1 could do similar stuff, like changing music depending on which lap you were on in Need for Speed 3, but it wasn't as dynamic. The laser that read disk info would have to search for new audio info when looping, for one thing. The N64 also had legendary, no pun intended, music implementation in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, allowing the player to play instruments to affect gameplay. Even though the N64 had the aforementioned, the PS1 had loads of rhythm-based games. It had Parappa the Rappa, Jammer Lammy, Bust a Move, Beat Mania, Dance Dance Revolution, Guitar Freaks, and much more. The N64 had a Mickey Mouse Dance Dance Revolution game only released in Japan. Since the PS1 had so many rhythm games when compared to the N64, and since it had other adaptive music elements similar to, albeit less popular than, those of the N64, I say PS1 gets the point here. So PS1 has already won, to be honest, but for funsies, let's check out the iconic music. This category is really interesting to me in this case, because by this point in their history, Nintendo had many established franchises, while PlayStation was the birthplace of so many IPs we know and love today. The N64 entrances in beloved franchises had their music capacities expanded to include new genres, including flamenco in Ocarina of Time, and country in Mario Kart 64. And some of the most iconic music from these franchises comes from their N64 entries. The N64 was also home to plenty of new franchises, a few of which came from Rare and Factor 5. Rare contributed new IPs like Diddy Kong Racing and Banjo-Kazooie, with music from famed video game composers David Wise and Grant Kirkhope respectively. Two of Factor 5's contributions were two new Star Wars game entries, Battle for Naboo and Rogue Squadron. In an interview with IGN, a representative from Factor 5 explained that they made, quote, completely new homemade drivers from top to bottom. In that respect, we owe Nintendo a big thank you for their cooperation. It's not like Nintendo isn't aware of some of the sound questions. They know that sound can count for a lot in a game, and I'm sure Nintendo isn't all that pleased with the sound that comes from many of the third-party games either. We probably did the same thing that Rare did and wrote new sound drivers from the ground up. We're using our own sample format, our own drivers. From the first to the last line of code, we're basically doing everything different from the way SGI had originally planned it, and then you could do a lot with the sound. As such, music from Rare and Factor 5's N64 games are often cited as favorites from the N64 fanbase, as they worked really hard to try to circumvent the conventional limits of the hardware when it came to audio. However, not many other companies did the same. This, in combination with limited memory allocations, resulted in the N64 versions of multi-platform games often having the worst versions of soundtracks. The Tony Hawk games were legendary for their soundtracks, and are often credited as setting the standard for licensed music in video games. They consistently included both popular musicians and underground acts, with deep album cuts from punk, ska, hip-hop, rock, and metal artists. That all sounds well and good on the PS1, but on the N64, you'd have these abridged versions of songs. For instance, the Dead Kennedys track Police Truck doesn't even get to the part of the song with lyrics before the memory limitations force it back to the starting point. Some franchises that previously called Nintendo home jumped ship to Sony during this era of gaming. Metal Gear Solid launched on the PS1, and yeah, there was a Game Boy Color Metal Gear Solid, but come on, and matched Kojima's revolutionary cinematic storytelling with cinematic music, paired with music growing in tension during action-packed gameplay segments. Final Fantasy VII also launched on the PlayStation after previously being considered for the N64, marking the franchise's big shift over to Sony. The franchise wouldn't return to a Nintendo home console until Crystal Chronicles on the GameCube, and Nintendo wouldn't get a numbered Final Fantasy entry again until the Switch, which finally brought Final Fantasies 7 through 12, excluding 11, to Nintendo hardware. For Final Fantasy VII, Nobuo Uematsu took advantage of the PlayStation's internal chip, stating, "I know many players were hoping that with the move to the PlayStation, we'd have studio-quality music, instead of the internal sound chip, like that used in the Super Famicom games. And I know other companies are recording CD-quality music for their games, but with Final Fantasy VII, we decided to do all the music with the PlayStation's internal chip. That's because as far as sound quality goes, we felt the PlayStation's hardware was more than capable. It had a higher dynamic range than the Super Famicom, and 24 voices. The Super Famicom had 8. The sound effects were all recorded in the studio, but the music, from start to finish, is all the PlayStation's internal chip. This way the music puts less demands on the read access time of the CD-ROM. It's stressful to be playing a game and have to wait all the time for the CD-ROM to load data. So we prioritized a less stressful experience over better sound quality. Though the music was not the highest quality the PS1 could pump out, it utilized similar techniques as famed classical composers used, such as motifs and choral backing to orchestral music. Uematsu switched over to live recordings with Final Fantasy VIII, And as mentioned in my previous Console Wars video on the SNES and Genesis, this music is performed often both in Final Fantasy specific concert series and other more general concerts, with music from 7 often making up a large chunk of that repertoire, and also charting high on Classic FM's Hall of Fame lists. It's really hard to choose a winner here, as both PS1 and N64 games have music with staying power, being performed, remixed, and adored all over the place even today. Honestly, strong arguments could be made for the iconicness of both consoles' exclusives, but the hardware of the N64 held back iconic soundtracks, like those of the Tony Hawk games. And even though I'm only thinking about exclusives in this category, it's clear that these limitations also held back exclusive games soundtracks, evidenced by the myriad of reused tracks for different stages in games like Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64. Look at the direct competitors, Crash Bandicoot and Crash Team Racing, and you'll find that, while taste is subjective, there is objectively more music in most PS1 games, with similar staying power to comparable titles on the N64. That might not be the most fair thing in the world since it harkens back to the hardware category, but these categories can only stay so far apart. They spill into each other, and in a major way here, so I'm giving the point to PlayStation. Now before you go typing your hate comments, I love N64 music. I was more of an N64 kid than a PS1 kid. I only got the PlayStation when the smaller PS1 version of it came out a little after the PS2 release, but I had the N64 kinda sorta around when it launched. I can't remember exactly since I was a kid, but I do remember having it well before PlayStation. Games like Donkey Kong 64 and Snowboard Kids had the soundtracks to my childhood. Looking back now though, and trying to be as objective as I can, I just gotta give it to PlayStation. Okay, now you can go type your hate comments, and once you're done with that, maybe like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.